I believe somebody knows his name. His name is Jesus. And he is a special gift. Amen. A special gift. And we are so grateful today for the many blessings that God has showered us with and the opportunity to be here one more time. We are truly thankful and grateful to God. Let's give God praise for our choir and worship leading on this morning. Thank you so much. We are in that season, and we thank God for what you all have shared with us. It's just good to be here this morning. Amen. Can you do something for me? Can you look at someone and just give them a smile and tell them it's good to be here? It's just a blessing to be in God's house one more time. I want to, this morning, look at a familiar passage of Scripture, and I want to take a different angle with this passage this morning. It's one that we've looked at before. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to tie together our last two themes that we've had as a church, and tying them together, we'll be able to launch our new theme for the upcoming year. But the passage I'd like to look at this morning is 1 Timothy chapter 1. So we look at a different angle of this passage. This is familiar. As we look at this passage, we also prepare for communion as well, which will have Holy Communion after the message on today. Amen. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, I thank Christ Jesus our Lord, who has given me strength, that he considered me faithful, appointing me to his service. I love that passage. Verse 15, here is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am not the best, but the worst. Into verse 12 again, he considered me faithful, appointing me to his service. Verse 15 again, came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for the blessings of this day. Thank you for bringing us together once again on this last first Sunday of this year. Thank you for the great reminders of who you are. You are Emmanuel. You're God with us. Thank you for the special gifts that you give to us. And we're just so grateful on this day for all that you do. Bless us now as we look into your word. Prepare our hearts, prepare our minds. Give to us a word that will change our lives for the better. As we change, we promise we'll give to you all the glory, the honor, and the praise. And so we pray this prayer this morning in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ. Amen. You may take your seats. Ushers, you can allow those in the foyer to come in at this time. Amen. Verse 12, Paul says he considered me faithful, and not only that, but he put me in his service in ministry. He answers the question of who put him there. I want to preach from the subject this morning, just two simple words: God did. Can you just look at somebody and say, God did? Come on, y'all need to help me a little bit better. Look at somebody else and just tell them, God did. All right. I was listening to a song which the song had several writers. And the writers of this song, as a part of it, began to describe situations that they had experienced. Part of the lyrics say, they wanted us down, but look at us now. They counted us out. They did not think that we were going to make it. They did not believe in us. But I know God did. How many of you are grateful and thankful this morning because you know that when others did not believe in you, God did. That they were sharing their personal stories, and in Christian language we would say that they were sharing their testimonies. And that's what's happening in this particular passage that we've read this morning. Paul, the apostle, is the writer of this letter, and he is sharing his personal testimony. Paul, when you read his writings and you reflect upon his testimony and the impact that it had on him and others around him, you notice these things are connected to it. Number one, when Paul would share his testimony would challenge his haters. What he had to say about his life, what he had to say about his God, what he had to say about what he had been through, what God had brought him through, it would challenge his haters. His haters were against the man, and they were against his message, and his haters were against Christ. So whenever Paul would testify, it would challenge his haters. But when Paul would testify, it would also challenge the systems that were present in various communities. On one occasion in Acts chapter 16, Paul is preaching and he is sharing the word of God. There's a young lady in that community that is being used by a group of men. She has a demon. Paul casts out the demon, changes that whole system of how they are dealing with her. She is changed, and the community becomes better. And so with his testimony, he challenges systems. And his testimony, when you study it, you see that it would cause him much pain. When Paul would share about the goodness of Christ, when Paul would talk about, again, what God brought him through, it would cause him much pain. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about being beaten. He talks about being imprisoned. He talks about being hungry, all because of his testimony about Christ. When we study Paul's testimony, we discover that it would change communities, and it would also change the world. Individuals who would accept Christ as a result of Paul's preaching would go to various places and share the good news of the gospel, and the community and the world would be changed. When Paul would testify, he would make this great claim that those who trust in Christ were not just conquerors, but they were more than conquerors. And so everywhere he would go, he would make that claim. And when Paul would testify, he would always make sure that God got to the glory. And so in this passage that we have before us this morning, 1 Timothy chapter 1, we see that Paul is testifying, and there's at least three things that you'll see in this passage. Number one, Paul makes it clear, he makes this clear. He says, God believed in me. And that's something that all of us should hold on to, that truth. The truth that God believes in you. And I wonder this morning, can you just look at someone and tell them, God believes in you? Paul makes that clear, and we're going to see that in this text this morning. But then the second thing we'll see in this text is not only does Paul make it clear that God believed in him, but he says, God is blessing me. And sometimes because of the pressures of life and all that we go through in the world, on our jobs, in our homes, we forget about the fact that the Lord is still blessing us. And I wonder this morning, are there any blessed folk here who know it? Look at somebody and tell them, I'm blessed today. And so we'll see in this text that Paul is saying, God believed in me, God blessed me. He said, but God is also building me. He's building me. He's doing a work in me. He's building me up. He's making something special. And even when I don't feel like it, or think like I look like it, God is still working. And God not only starts a work, but he finishes the work that he begins in us. And I think it would be great for us to look at somebody this morning and tell them, God is building you. He's building something special. And so Paul writes this letter. He's writing to Timothy, his son in the ministry. He's writing to inform Timothy. He's writing to instruct Timothy. He's writing to empower Timothy. He's writing to encourage Timothy. And at the time of the text, he is pouring into Timothy, who represents at that time the present generation. But not only is Paul pouring into him like a libation, he is also pouring into him, teaching him how to pour into others. That's why in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, Paul would say to Timothy, the things that you've gotten from me, give it to other folks, and then teach them how to share it with others as well. And so in this passage, in this particular chapter, 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul speaks with transparency. He is open. His heart is open. His life is open. And he's speaking to Timothy this way because he's hoping that his testimony would change Timothy's life, that it would make him stronger. And so in verse 13, it's very interesting. Paul talks about who he was and what he was. Look at what he says in verse 13. You've seen this before. Paul says, I was once a blasphemer. He says, I was one who persecuted the church. He says, I was a violent man. It's important to remember sometimes about who we used to be. Do I have a witness here? Anybody ever take a moment and look back over your life and reflect upon who you used to be? And I wonder this morning, is there anybody who can give God praise? Because when you look back over your life, you can say, I used to be, but God has brought me a mighty long way. Somebody ought to give him praise right now. Paul says, this is what I was. It's who I was. But notice in verse 15, he doesn't talk about who he was. He says, this is who I am. In verse 15, he says, I am the worst of sinners. In verse 13, he says, I was a blasphemer. I was a persecutor. I was a violent person. He says, but I'm still struggling with some stuff right now. He says, I am the worst. And so Paul opens up to Timothy. He pulls back the curtain. He says, here's who I was, but here's who I am. And my brothers and sisters, when we analyze this text, It's important to know this, and I hope that you grab this morning and hold on to this. Paul is saying that God saw me at my worst, but still saw my worth. Somebody ought to give God praise. He saw me at my worst, but he didn't stop looking. He still saw worth in me. And this says something very interesting about God. God sees us at our worst, and he sees our worth simultaneously. He sees both at the same time. He knows the good and he knows the bad. I think you ought to look at somebody and tell them, God knows all about me. He sees my worst, but he says, I still have worth. Isn't it interesting when we mess up in life and others find out? They write us off, many times forgetting that they have done the same thing. Y'all don't want me to preach this morning, do you? But Paul is saying in this particular passage, God knows who I am, and I know who I am. He says, I know what I was, and he says, I understand the impact of what I've done. I know where I'm at right now. In other words, like he said to the church at Rome, he says, I understand that even though I've made progress, when I would do good, evil is still present with me. But he says, God doesn't just see me in my mistakes. Here's what he's saying. He says that God sees my problem. But not only does God see my problem, God also sees my potential. And I need to help somebody this morning. You may have some problems and some issues, but you still have great potential. Look at somebody and tell them there's greatness in you. Can y'all help me this morning? He sees not only the problem, he sees the potential of what we can become. But let me tell you what else God sees. God also sees the finished product. In other words, if we get stuck looking at what we are and where we are right now, we might think that we're going to live here and be this way forever. But God is at work in your life. And he not only knows where you are right now, he knows what he's shaping you and making you to become. Somebody ought to give God praise, not just based on where you are right now, but you know that God is working, and he's working something special in your life. That's why I love the hymn writer who said, "Amazing grace shall always be my song of praise. For it was grace that brought my liberty. I do not know why he came or how he came to love me so, but he looked beyond my faults." Somebody ought to just shout, "Beyond my faults." "And he saw my needs. I shall forever lift my eyes to Calvary to view the cross where Jesus died for me. How marvelous the grace that caught my falling soul." He looked beyond my fault, and he saw my needs. God doesn't get stuck on our faults. He looks beyond that. And so Paul says, it's what I love about God. He says, God saw me at my worst, but he still saw my worth. Second thing Paul is saying in this text is my worst did not impact his will for my life. Aren't you glad that God wouldn't let you mess it up? Look at somebody and tell them, I'm so glad that God wouldn't let me mess it up. Look at what Paul says in verse 12. He says, I'm thankful. I'm thankful. I thank Christ Jesus, our Lord. I'm a thankful person. I'm thankful because the Lord did something for me. He said, the Lord gave me strength. And here it is. He said he gave me strength. Now you've got to take a step back to really see this. In verse 15, Paul says, Christ Jesus came in the world to save sinners. So he's already declaring that he's saved. And he's answering the question based around the ideal of whose ideal was it to save me? Who thought I was worth saving? Who saved me? And Paul makes it clear, God did it. Even for those who thought that Paul shouldn't be saved, Paul says, I ain't worried about what y'all think. He says, God did it. God saved me. And I wonder this morning, is that anybody's testimony? Can you say that God did it? It was nobody but the Lord who saved me. But here's the interesting part. Back in verse 12, Paul says, not only did he save me, he gave me strength. Now we all need strength. The Greek ideal of the word is empowerment. And Paul says he didn't just save me, but what he did was he empowered me. He gave me ability. He gave me strength. And so if someone were to ask you, who gave you your strength? The response that we should make is similar to the one that Paul would make. Who gave it to you? God did. And I wonder this morning, y'all, to help me this morning. I'm going to get happy all by myself. Is there anybody here that's grateful and happy and thankful that God gave you strength? How many of you ran out of strength a long time ago? But you're operating today on the strength that God has given to you. Come on, put your hands together and give God some praise for the strength that he gave you. Who gave it to you? Look at somebody and tell them God did. But that's not all he says. In verse 12, he says he gave me strength and he considered me faithful. In other words, God looked at me not just where I was, but he looked at what I could become. And he says when he looked at my life, he gave me strength, and God counted me as one who he could count on, one that would be trustworthy. Oh, my brothers and sisters, I'm sure that this gave Paul great joy to know that when God looked at him, God said, he is someone that I can count on. I want you to know this morning. You are someone that God can count on. God says to Paul that you're faithful. And so Paul would have to conclude the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing because God did this thing. God looked at me as messed up as I am and said, you are faithful. And I think you ought to help me this morning. Can you just rename yourself for a moment? Just look at yourself, touch yourself on the chest like this and say, I am faithful. Now look at your neighbor and tell him, you have a new name. Oh, I know they've called you undependable, and maybe we have been at a time in our life, but things are different now. God can count on me. Do I have a witness here? If God can count on you, lift your hand and tell it and say, God can count on me. But that's not all he said. Here it is, verse 12. He says that he counted me faithful. He appointed me to his service. In other words, God put me in ministry. He says, I didn't do it on my own. It wasn't my plan. He says, God did this thing. And my brothers and sisters, we ought to have great joy today, because some folks are looking at us right now and wondering, how can we do what we do? Why are we blessed the way that we are? Who did this thing? Who operated all of this? And our answer is very simple. God did it. And I wonder this morning, is there anybody here who can say, God put me in ministry? Can you say that? Look at your neighbor and tell him, God put me in ministry. If the truth was told, if we had our way, we would walk away from everybody. Do I have a witness here? If the truth were told, some of us would say, I don't have time for this mess anymore. Oh, come on, y'all might as well be honest. As a matter of fact, when it comes to some relationships, if you did not believe that God put you there, you would have walked away a long time ago. Who put me together? Who put me in ministry? Somebody ought to shout out, God did. And so in the text, Paul is saying that it was the Lord who put me in this ministry. He says, my worst did not impact his will for my life. He says he saved me. He's working on me. He put me in service. But then when you look at what else, he says God did something very special. He showered me with mercy and with grace. Somebody ought to just say mercy. Somebody ought to say grace. Think about this. Paul says, I'm the worst, but God still put me in. I counted myself out, but God counted me in. People counted me out, but God counted me in. I made mistakes in life, but God counted me in. How did we get in? We got in because of God's mercy and because of God's grace. And I wonder today, can you give him praise for his mercy? The things that should have happened that God did not allow to happen. Do I have a witness here? Aren't you glad that God held some things back? Held some punishment back. Somebody just say mercy. And then not only did he give us mercy, but he poured out his grace on us. And here's the blessing right here. We may be and we are imperfect, but we are walking in favor. Do I have a witness here? You ought to look at somebody and tell them you got favor all over your life. You do know we have favor, right? There are some jobs we have that we didn't qualify for. Somebody say favor. There's some property that we bought that we didn't qualify for. Somebody say favor. There's some doors that were open that we could not get in on our own. Somebody say favor. He woke me up this morning. Somebody say favor. He started me on another day's journey. Somebody say favor. And so Paul says he showered me with mercy, with grace, and with favor. How many of you today, when you think about the mercy that you have, the favor that you have, if somebody asks you, where did you get it from? Who gave it to you? You'd have to say, God did. Look at somebody and say, God did. The favor on my life came from God. The mercy in my life came from God. The blessings in my life came from God. I didn't deserve it, but God did it. Yeah! God did it. Now look at this. I'm just about finished. The last thing that Paul says, he makes it plain. He said, God did it for a specific reason. Look at somebody and tell them God always has a plan. He says in verse 16, God took the worst. And Paul calls himself the worst. And can I remind you why he calls himself the worst? He knows what he has done. He knows the secret stuff. Do I have a witness here? You ought to look at your neighbor and tell him, I know what I have done. Come on, tell him that. And he says, based on what I know about me, I don't have time to compare myself with somebody else and their errors or faults. So Paul says, I'm just going to conclude that I am the worst. Can I help somebody this morning? Stop comparing yourself with other people. Just think about what you've done and thank God that he has delivered you. I dare somebody who's honest this morning to lift your hands to the Lord and just tell him thank you for deliverance. So here it is. Paul says, I am the worst. But God wanted to do something. He wanted to demonstrate the greatness of his mercy. And he wanted to show the world how patient he is. And aren't you glad that God is a patient God? Are you glad that he's patient with you? Come on. How many times have you said, Lord, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again? Thank God for his patience. Somebody say, thank God for his patience. And so he wanted to demonstrate how patient he was. So he takes the worst and he puts the worst on display. And he makes the worst visible. And he sends a message to those who are watching. And he says, do you see what I can do with this person. And if I can do it for them, can you imagine what I can do for you? Oh, I think somebody ought to give God praise. Because when we think about our own lives and we think about the things that God has done for us, aren't you glad that he's done great things, unbelievable things, undeniable things? How many of you can say, when I look back over my life and I began to think things over, I realized where I was. I realized the things that I did. But look at me now. God is blessing me. And how many of us, when we testify, we tell folks, you just don't know what the Lord has done for me. He brought me a mighty long way. Do I have a witness here? And if he did it for me, guess what? He can do it for you. Do I have a witness here? The worst still have worth. You are valuable to the Lord God Almighty. Why don't you put your hands together right now and give the Lord some praise? Yeah. Can you look at somebody and tell them you're valuable? Tell somebody else, tell them you're valuable. And if they want to know how you got to where you are, tell them it wasn't me. It was God who did it. Can somebody just say, God did it? In the presence of my enemies, God did it. In the face of my haters, God did it. In the presence of all those who doubted me, God did it. Come on and give God some praise one more time. God did it. And he deserves all the glory, honor, and praise. That's why in verse 17, Paul says, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to bless God's name. Now, unto him, the one who is king, the one who has all power, be glory now. Somebody say now. I'm not going to just wait till I get over there, but now. He gets the glory now and forever. Can you look at somebody and tell them my praise won't stop? Tell them my praise won't stop. I'm starting right now, and I'm going to continue on. Yeah! Forever and ever and ever and ever. I can't thank him enough. All of my mistakes, I can't thank him enough. He looked beyond all of that stuff. I can't thank him enough. He gave me not a second chance, but another chance, and another chance, and another chance. Now, be the glory right now, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Don't tell me to stop praising him. You just don't know what the Lord has done for me forever, now, and forever. Don't tell me it don't take all that. You just don't know how far down I was when he reached down and picked me up. Now and forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Paul says, I was and am the worst. but I still have worth. Don't allow people to devalue who you are. Just because they are aware of a few mistakes that you have made. Don't let nobody fool you. They got some skeletons in their closet too. Do I have a witness here? Turn to somebody and tell them they got skeletons in their closet too. Come on, tell them. Some of the skeletons have flesh on them. Fresh mistakes. Some people just know how to hide a little better than you do. Don't let people tell you that you have no value. Paul says, I did all this and I'm the worst, but God still uses me. He still uses me. He put me in ministry. He did it. God did it. Not because I was perfect. Can you tell somebody, tell them I'm not perfect. Look at them and smile and tell them I may look like it. I may look like it, but tell them I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. But God did something special in my life. He said, you're doing this. You're doing this. You're doing this. And aren't you glad he's a patient God? Our stories are different. But don't we have a story to tell? Look at somebody and tell them, I have a story to tell. Our stories are different. And the stories serve as a platform for God. God can say, look at what I can do. Somebody said he can take a mess and perform a miracle. Anybody's life ever been a mess? Come on and be honest. And has he performed a miracle in your life? Come on and give him praise right now. Come on, put your hands together and give him praise. My God. And so we thank him. We thank him. How did it happen? God did it. God did it. God did it. Somebody just say, God did it. God did it. He did it. He gets the glory. He gets the honor. And he gets the praise.